On the outskirts of Cottonwood, every morning the cowboy still set the table for two, though only one remained. Then a strange woman appeared, carrying a limp and a silence heavier than the desert wind. No one could have guessed that a single loaf of bread placed in the town square that day would change the way the whole town saw one another, and bind two people to stay in each other's lives. Part 1. Shadows at the Edge of the Prairie. Morning in Cottonwood began with a light as thin as linen, spread over the hillsides and the dry grasslands waiting for the wind. Elias Boone stood on his porch, one hand resting loosely on the weathered railing, listening to the breeze rustle along the barbed wire fence. He had built this wooden house 20 years ago, back when it still held the sound of laughter and the smell of fresh bread whenever his wife was alive. Now the only sound was the creak of the door hinges each time the wind shifted. Since her passing, Elias had folded himself into his work as if land and cattle could fill the hollow she'd left. He rose before the light was full, lit the stove, checked the fences, then rode out into the fields, becoming another shadow in the dawn mist. Supper was no more than a loaf of bread, a bowl of beans, and a glass of cold water eaten by the fire, the chair across from him forever empty. That chair had never been removed, perhaps because he wasn't ready to accept it, would always stay that way. The people of Cottonwood knew Elias as a man of few words, keeping his distance the way the open range kept its distance from town. Those who owed him paid on time. Those who bought cattle knew the price he named would not change. He was fair, but he was not friendly. Years in the wild had taught him that to keep the peace, you sometimes had to fence yourself off from people as well. So when someone knocked at his door, asking for work, Elias usually refused, claiming he could handle it all himself, partly because he didn't want to be tangled in other people's troubles, partly because he'd grown used to the quiet. Beneath that stillness lay a wall built from betrayals, business partners, old acquaintances who had shaken his hand at market, then turned away when times got hard. Out here, a promise could weigh less than dust. Yet this morning, as the sunlight reached the edge of the porch, Elias felt a different kind of emptiness. The wind carried the smell of damp earth from the valley, and from far off came the steady beat of hoofsteps, making him glance toward the road. Along the dirt track leading to the ranch, a small figure appeared in the golden dust, a lone traveler with a cloth sack over her shoulder, walking as if distance meant nothing. Elias stayed still, fingers tightening slightly on the railing. From here he couldn't make out her face, only the slight frame and the way she held herself apart from anything or anyone she might pass. The sight stirred something mixed, wariness and a flicker of curiosity. In the West, strangers often brought trouble, but sometimes they brought something you didn't know you needed. She came closer, and he saw she was young. She stopped a few paces short of the fence, meeting his gaze across the open air. Her eyes didn't exactly plead, but they weren't cold either. They had the look of someone long used to caution, yet still hoping for a door to open. A faint, unsteady current moved through Elias's chest before he forced it down. Out here, kindness given in the wrong place could become a noose. Even so, his hand eased the porch door open a little wider, letting in more light and wind. Not an invitation, just a sign he was listening. Then he waited to see if she would walk on or stop at the steps of the man the whole town called the Silent Rancher. In that moment, between the open ground and two people who didn't yet know each other's names, something began. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to change the course of them both. Part 2. A slow rhythm in the wooden house. Summer in Cottonwood lingered, but the late-season sunlight had softened, pouring its gentler gold across the faded planks. Clara Wynne arrived on such an afternoon, quiet, with eyes deep enough to keep their own counsel, hands resting lightly on the straps of her cloth sack. Elias Boone opened the door just wide enough to look her over. He remembered the first impression clearly, a dry wind and the scent of road dust trailing her into the porch. No long introduction, just a plain workmanlike request for a job, like a hammer striking once into a beam. In this town, those who turned up without warning often carried a past they'd rather not name, and Elias, long practiced in keeping his distance, had no habit of digging into what people didn't offer. He nodded, showed her the kitchen, the small room beside the storeroom, and listed the day's chores. She listened, nodded in return, and said no more. That was how it began. Simple and quiet. Life on the ranch didn't change its pace. At first light, Elias headed for the corrals, while Clara stayed behind to light the stove, wash the rice, measure flour into the blackened skillet. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the smell of roasting coffee mingled with wood smoke drifted into the space between them. Two people who'd never planned to share much at all. By day, Elias tended the fields, checked fences, and moved the herd. Clara washed clothes, pegged them on the wooden rail, mended quilts. If their paths crossed, it was with a nod or a glance. Elias didn't ask her into the pasture, and she didn't step beyond the yard unless there was need. The gap between them was like an invisible line, keeping each on their own side. Supper was the only time they shared a table. The long wooden board had two places, one at the head, one to the left. Between them sat a dish of beans, a loaf of bread, and sometimes salted meat. The knife only tapped against the cutting board when necessary. The rest was the sound of wind through the window and the crackle of wood in the stove. Clara worked with such precision that Elias found no cause to complain. Everything was neat, as if she meant to leave as little trace of herself as possible. He had known people like that, those who carried their guard the way they carried their shadow. They relied on no one and let no one find a way in. Some nights, when the moon angled through the window, Elias saw her cross the yard with a bundle of laundry in her arms, her steps unhurried but steady. Even in passing, he noticed something both fragile and unyielding in the way she moved, and though he kept his reserve, he couldn't deny he had started to notice those small details, like a man long used to silence becoming aware of another set of footsteps alongside his own. In those early days, Elias's caution still held. He had been burned before by trusting the wrong person, and he wouldn't be caught out again. But between the foggy mornings and the quiet suppers, he began to see that Clara's presence, distant though it was, softened the emptiness in the wooden house, not with words, but with quiet movement, with the steady calm she carried inside her. He didn't know what might come next, but somewhere inside, a portion of his mistrust gave way to something at once strange and familiar, like discovering after many years that the house once again held the breath of two people. Part 3. A scratch in the morning. That morning the air was still thick with mist. The kitchen window glass was clouded with condensation, yet Elias could still make out Clara's shape moving inside. He had just returned from the stables, his boots damp with soil, a wooden bucket swinging empty from his hand. The wind carried the scent of new grass and a trace of wood smoke from the stove. But what made him pause was the way she walked. Clara was carrying a tray, moving as though each step required a measured decision. Her left hand gripped the edge of the table for balance, her shoulder tilting slightly. The first spill of daylight through the window fell across her pale face, catching the faint crease between her brows when her foot met the floor. Elias stood still on the porch. His first instinct wasn't concern. It was the old wariness that came like muscle memory, the reflex of a man who'd seen too many stories he wanted no part of. He had met people who feigned weakness to draw out pity or pry into another's kindness. Out here, not everyone was what they appeared to be. And yet, there was something in her eyes, only for an instant as she turned her head, that stopped him. It wasn't the calculation of someone angling for advantage, but something else, deeper, like a crack that didn't want to be seen. He opened the door, the hinges giving a soft but certain groan. Clara glanced up, startled. In the space of a heartbeat, her expression shifted, surprise, then quickly masked as she bent toward the table and carried on. The smell of fresh coffee reached him, but he noticed her hand tremble slightly as she set down the kettle. Neither of them spoke. He hung his hat on the wooden peg beside the door, sat down at the table, and kept his gaze steady on her. Outside, the wind hissed against the walls, while inside the soft ring of a spoon against a cup kept time. Every movement she made was overly careful, as if she feared breaking something. In that silence, Elias felt another kind of mist settle in the kitchen, not from the window pane, but from whatever sat between them. It was as real as a split in the floorboards, even if it had no name. He remembered the times he had ignored signs like these in others, and the cost that came later. He also remembered how it felt to discover that someone he'd once suspected had turned out to be the only one who stood with him when it counted. When Clara turned toward the shelves, he saw it clearly now. Her light tread wasn't habit. It was a way to keep weight off one leg. And with that came the quiet thought. Perhaps her story wasn't what he had braced himself against. But as always, he held his tongue. No questions, no judgments. He sat there, looking out the window where the sunlight was edging higher, listening to the wind thread itself into the low crackle of the stove fire. Between the scent of coffee and fresh bread there was still distance. But it was no longer only the wall of mistrust. There was now a hairline fracture just wide enough for light to slip through one day. Part 4. A silence heavy as wind. That morning, the kitchen still smelled of fresh coffee, but it was no longer the comforting scent it used to be. It mingled with a silence so thick it felt as if every mote of dust in the air had paused mid-flight, waiting for something neither of them wanted to name. Elias Boone sat at the table, one hand curved around a stoneware cup, his thumb slowly tracing the tiny chip on its rim. It was an old habit, one he used when he needed to keep from speaking his mind. Across from him, Clara Wynne moved about the kitchen with a precision so exact it might have seemed mechanical. Yet today, that exactness carried tension. He noticed her avoiding his eyes. Each time he happened to look her way, she dropped her gaze, pretending to polish the table or rearrange items already in order. The paring knife gleamed on the cutting board, untouched. A truly busy person didn't have gaps like that in their movements. Elias had lived long enough to know the spaces in a person's actions mattered as much as what they said. Often they revealed more than a confession. And here, in the small kitchen where only the wall clock ticked, he could hear Clara's silence as clearly as the wind scraping along the fence outside. Once, when Elias stepped toward the cupboard for the salt, Clara retreated faster than she needed to, as though even the chance of being too close was something she could not bear. It happened in a blink, but it was enough to make him stop. He didn't ask, didn't try to reassure. Out here, sometimes silence was the only way to let someone keep their pride. The wind on the porch rose suddenly, tilting the sunlight through the window. Dust motes drifted slowly in the beam, suspended in midair. Through that shimmer, Elias caught sight of Clara standing in the far corner. She looked smaller than she had before, her shoulders slightly drawn in, a cup of coffee in her hand she wasn't drinking from. The old suspicion was still there, the instinctive guard of a man who'd been betrayed more than once. But running alongside it now, like a crack spreading in a stone wall, was the faint recognition that her silence wasn't hiding scheming, but shielding hurt. Elias didn't try to break it. He sat quietly, letting the hush stay where it was, the way one leaves a cut, beneath its bandage to heal unseen. Outside, the wind kept its steady rhythm, carrying the dry scent of grass and the early chill of the coming season into a kitchen that had been cold long before. And in that chill, they still sat at opposite ends of the table, not speaking yet no longer entirely turned away from each other. Part 5. A figure on the market road. Cottonwood's market was noisy from first light, but Elias Boone only went when he had to. He liked to stand at the edges where he could see without being jostled. That day was no different. Autumn's late sun spilled across the wooden awnings, catching the gold dust in the air. He had just traded a sack of salt for 2 new coils of rope when he saw Clara win. She was at the fabric stall, her back bent slightly toward a roll of pale blue cloth, fingertips brushing the edge as if weighing a decision. The coat she wore was worn at the seams, but Elias sensed that wasn't why she drew back half a step. A shadow cut the light from her shoulder. Ralph Denton. He appeared as though he'd been watching all along, striding in without so much as a glance at anyone else. His crooked smile wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind Elias had seen when a man believed he held power over another. In that moment, Elias caught Clara's eyes. It wasn't the startled look of a stranger bumped by chance. It was the instant tightening of someone who'd been here before, whose body recognized the threat before her mind had to name it. Her gaze darkened like a lake clouded over by sudden shadow. For a heartbeat she seemed smaller, and the hand on the cloth's edge curled in as if to pull entirely away. Ralph said something Elias couldn't catch, then leaned in just enough to make Clara retreat another step. He left without buying a thing, leaving behind only the smell of tobacco and the kind of space no one wanted to stand in. Clara lingered a few seconds, then turned away, walking faster than usual. Elias stayed where he was, far enough not to draw notice. At first, the old instinct was there. Distrust. Ralph was a man he didn't care for, but Elias also knew better than to tangle himself in someone else's trouble unless there was no other choice. Still, the image of Clara's eyes clung to him, sharp as an old wound stung raw by dust and wind. He had been the one in that position once, cornered by a stronger man, looking around and finding no one willing to step forward. The memory itself had blurred, but the feeling remained. The cold down the spine, the quiet helplessness that made a man wish he could vanish. Elias didn't go to Clara. He didn't call after her. He only watched her leave, knowing that something between them had shifted without a single word spoken. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that silence would soon press him to a choice. Either turn away like everyone else, or step into the empty space everyone avoided. Part 6. A Scratch in Memory. That noon, Elias Boone returned to the ranch earlier than usual. The sun was high, throwing hard white light across the ground, but he still carried the mute chill that had settled on him since the market. The image of Clara's eyes when she faced Ralph Denton kept replaying in his mind, clear as the thud of a nail driven into wood. It wasn't only fear, it was the ingrained reflex of someone who'd endured it often enough that the response was muscle deep. Elias set the feed sack quietly against the porch post, gazing out at the pasture. The wind bent the yellowed grass flat, and suddenly a memory came unbidden. His younger years. The day an older hand from the cattle crew cornered him at a way station. That man had cost him his wages by blaming him for a spoiled delivery. Everyone nearby knew the truth, but no one stepped in. The silence had been the hardest thing to swallow, heavy as a stone lodged in his chest. Since then, Elias had learned to fence his life in tight, to keep clear of anything that wasn't his concern. It made life simpler, left fewer gaps for trouble to slip through. But now, standing in his familiar yard, he realized he'd just seen himself again, in Clara's small retreat on that market road. He stepped into the house, the sound of his boots on the dry boards echoing sharper than usual. Clara was at the kitchen counter, back turned, slicing bread. Her shoulders drew in slightly, as though trying to take up less space. The knife moved in steady rhythm, but Elias noticed the faint pause between each cut. He thought about speaking, then let it pass. Sometimes questions only made a person's guard rise higher. Instead, he walked through to the back door, stepped down into the yard, and stood looking toward the line of trees. But in his mind, a decision was forming, slow and certain as wind-carving stone. If what he'd seen in the market was the truth, he couldn't let it stand. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of cooking smoke from somewhere in town. Elias drew in a long breath, then turned back inside. Still silent, the space between them felt heavier than ever. But this time he knew he didn't want to keep it that way. Some walls, left standing too long, block out not only trouble but the light and warmth as well. Part 7. Footprints outside the cabin. In the days after the market, Elias Boone paid closer attention to what moved around the ranch, not by watching with suspicion, but with the quiet, long-trained awareness of a man who could read the language of earth and wind. One evening, as the sun drew back behind the ridge, Elias led his horse around the granary. The narrow dirt path wound toward the small cabin where Clara lived, hidden behind a stand of birch. He rarely went that way unless there was work to be handed off. But that day something caught his eye. Fresh impressions in the dirt. They weren't Clara's boot prints. These were smaller, and they weren't his either. The tread angled slightly to one side, the way a man might walk if his gait was uneven. Elias knelt, fingertips brushing the damp surface, feeling where the dust had yet to settle. Whoever it was had been here not long ago. Beside the boot prints lay hoof marks. One look told him they weren't from his herd. The shape was long and narrow, the shoe worn unevenly, a rider's mount built for the road, not a range horse. He stood there for a while, listening to the birch leaves whisper and the faint clatter of dry wood knocking together in the wind. The old wariness rose in him again, this time with a cold edge along his spine. In the West, not everyone came calling with good intentions. Elias walked slowly toward the cabin. The door was shut, curtains drawn tight, with only a thin slit of light showing at the edge. He didn't knock or call her name. Instead, he circled to the back where the ground was softer near the water barrel. There the prints and hoof marks stopped, circling in place, as if someone had stood there a long while before leaving. A stranger lingering around the hired girl's cabin. This was not something to take lightly, and Elias knew better than most that unaccounted-for visits always carried a story, often one nobody wanted told. Back at the granary he hung the saddle on its peg, but his mind stayed with those prints. Clara's silence, the look in her eyes at the market, and now these tracks. They were lining up into a cord he could almost follow. He didn't yet know where the other end lay, but he was certain of one thing: it wouldn't lead anywhere peaceful. From the porch of the main house he looked again toward the birch stand. The last of the light was gone, leaving a dark patch spreading across the ground. And in that shadow Elias felt more certain than ever something had stepped into his quiet life, and though he didn't yet have a name for it, he would have to face it soon. Part 8. The things no one says. Cottonwood wasn't a big town, but it had a way of moving private matters faster than the wind. From the string of wooden awnings along Main Street to the saloon on the eastern corner where banjo notes slipped out the window, every story found its way to someone who cared, or pretended not to. Elias Boone had lived here long enough to know one unspoken rule. Some things everybody knew, but nobody said aloud. A nod between two men at the saloon, a glance turned away when someone passed. Those things carried meaning, and high on the list of things not to speak of was Ralph Denton. Ralph was a horse trader with a voice that always seemed to hold a trace of a sneer, and a web of dealings that touched nearly everyone in town. Some owed him favors, others owed him money. Those who opposed him, or dared to stand in his way, often left town sooner than they'd planned, leaving little behind. Elias was among the few who owed Ralph nothing, save for a debt of another kind from the day Ralph had used a trick to cut him out of a cattle sale years back. Since then, there'd been a cold distance between them, though never an open fight. It was that knowledge of Ralph that made the hair at the back of Elias's neck rise when he put together Ralph's sudden appearance at the market, with the footprints and hoof marks near Clara's cabin. The pieces didn't fit cleanly, but they formed a shadowed outline. Ralph had a reason to come near her, and in Elias's experience, that reason rarely meant anything good. That evening, Elias stood on the porch, looking toward the road out of town. The wind carried the laughter of a group outside the saloon, and with it the faint, acrid scent of smoke from Ralph's horse pens. It brought back memories of deals struck on open range, when one wrong mark on a ledger could cost a man his season's work. He had thought he'd left matters with Ralph behind, but like dust on a coat, the past needed only a gust of wind to return. Elias wasn't one to chase rumors, but he didn't ignore signs either. His old distrust of Ralph now had something new laced through it. The sense that Clara was standing inside a circle Ralph had drawn before, one he'd seen others struggle to step out of. And if she was caught in it, leaving would not be easy. Twilight slid down over the rooftops, the last of the day's light glancing off the boards of the porch. Elias's hand tightened on the rail, feeling the coarse grain of the wood under his palm. He'd lived his life steering clear of the muddy water. The town sometimes stirred, keeping himself and the ranch outside of trouble. But as he listened to the birches rustle and looked toward the small cabin, he knew, this time, his fences might not be enough to keep the outside world from crossing over. Part 9. The Loaf on the Table. That afternoon, the late sun slanted through the kitchen window, laying warm gold bands across the dark grain of the table. Elias Boone stepped inside, carrying the scent of dry hay and the faint chill from the yard. He set a cloth bag on the chair beside him, and from it drew a freshly baked loaf. The crust cracked lightly as he placed it down, its sweet, warm aroma edging out the lingering smoke from the stove. Clara Wynne was in the corner, wiping down a table that had already been cleaned. At the sound of his boots, she turned her head slightly, then looked away, resuming her work as if avoiding a direct meeting. Elias watched for a moment without speaking, then pulled out a chair and sat. He set the loaf in front of him, then, with deliberate slowness, nudged it toward her. No explanation, no questions, just a small gesture, quiet but carrying an unmistakable intent. Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking from the bread to his face, as if unsure whether to touch it. Elias didn't press her. He stayed still, hands resting on the table, gaze steady. Out here, small gestures often meant more than words. He wanted her to know this wasn't an exchange for something, nor a hidden trap, only a safe place carved out of a wind-heavy afternoon. At last, Clara stepped forward and laid her hand on the loaf, feeling the heat it still held. For a moment, their eyes met longer than they ever had before. There was no smile, but neither was there the usual evasion. Only a brief meeting of gazes that told Elias some small piece of her guard had eased. He leaned back and poured water into his own cup. The silence still unbroken. Clara carried the loaf to the counter, her movements lighter than when she had entered the kitchen. The sight of her then reminded Elias of people he'd met on the open range, those who had come through sandstorms and still knew how to cherish a patch of shade when they found it. The light faded from the room, leaving the kitchen in a muted warmth. Elias stayed seated, listening to the sound of a knife slicing through the crust, the brittle crackle breaking into small fragments. No words of thanks were spoken, but he felt it in the unhurried care of her movements. And sometimes, he thought, it was the quiet gratitude that lingered the longest in memory. Part 10. The Loaf in the Square. That morning the market square in Cottonwood carried the dry light of early autumn, like a dusting of chalk over the wooden awnings and stacked sacks of flour. Hooves tapped across the planked bridge, shutters clapped, and voices haggled low as drizzle. Here people knew the unspoken rules. Some names should be spoken softly, and some matters left untouched. Ralph Denton's was one of them. Eyes slid over him the way wind brushed grass, without lingering long enough to carry his scent of trouble. Elias Boone came to market as he always did, leading his horse along the fringe of the crowd, hat brim low, his shadow blending with the post-shadows. He looked no different except for the brown-wrapped bundle he carried close to his chest, like something important enough to trust to no one else. He didn't stop at the saloon, didn't linger by the rope stalls, didn't trade for salt or nails. He walked straight to the open center of the square, the space where horse auctions were held, the planks still scratched by iron shoes, the air still holding the smell of chaff and sweat in the sun. Elias set the bundle on an upturned barrel. A few boys shooting marbles paused mid-play. The patent medicine man lifted his head. A dairy woman tightened her shawl. He unwrapped it and took out a fresh loaf, its crust fissured fine as leaf veins, its warmth rising into his calloused hands. It could have been nothing, a rancher setting bread in the market. But in Cottonwood, placing something in the center of the planks was like ringing the church bell. It summoned attention. He didn't speak at once. Elias stood still, scanning the square like a man measuring wind before deciding whether to burn the brush pile. Around him, talk slowed, then stilled. When the quiet was just right, he turned the loaf so the fine dusting of flour showed clearly to every side. On it, marked in ash dark strokes from his own fire, were the long, narrow arcs of a hoofprint, the same print he'd found outside Clara's cabin days ago. A cough came from the hardware stall. The saloon-keeper crossed his arms, touching a finger to his chin, the way men did when they meant to remember without speaking. Farmers near the platform shifted aside, making a subtle lane from the end of the street to the barrel. At the far end of it, Ralph Denton leaned on a saloon post, one leg crossed, the edge of his boot rubbing the plank, that thin knife smile resting on his mouth. Elias didn't look his way. He lifted the loaf, set it on the worn planks so a drift of flour fell in a pale line, like trail dust. Then he said, his voice low enough for the near ring to hear, others would catch it second-hand. Bread's fit to eat, but left here on the boards, it'll be spoiled by the first boot that treads on it. Town matters are no different. Let a mark fall in the same place often enough, and folks stop seeing it until it's habit. That was all. No names, no charges. The sun shifted, throwing the bread's shadow long across the planks, touching the curved scratches like those on its crust. The innkeeper dropped her ring of keys. The blacksmith rested his hammer on his thigh, leaning forward. Someone drew a sharp breath. Someone else pulled a child behind her skirt. In the air, a wire had been pulled taut. Ralph pushed off the post, stepped once, slow enough to set his boot square over an old mark, and stopped. The smile was still there, but his eyes had narrowed. He said nothing. In Cottonwood, silence could strike back. But this silence did not feel on his side. Elias brushed a stray pinch of flour from the barrel's edge, like a man tidying before a meal. He offered no further word. The loaf lay there harmless in shape, but now a signpost, hoof marks pressed into the pale dust. A boy bent to touch it, only to be pulled gently back by his mother, not from fear of dirt, but because grown folks understood. Some signals shouldn't be smudged while eyes were on them. A middle-aged man dipped his head toward Elias, small enough to vanish into the shuffle of shadows. The milk seller shifted her heavy can to the other arm, her gaze darting from the saloon porch back to the bread. The storekeeper set down a brass weight more slowly than usual, letting it roll to a stop at the counter's edge. Together these small things became another kind of voice the town had heard and was deciding how to hear. Elias stepped back half a pace as if to make room for someone to pass. No one did. The crowd didn't press in, didn't scatter, only let the wind turn under the awnings, carrying the scent of flour and stove ash. He tipped his hat lower and left by the edge of the market, the way he'd come. He didn't look back. His part ended when the loaf touched the boards. The rest belonged to the eyes now open. Behind him, Cottonwood breathed on, but the rhythm had changed. Whispers began, fine as thread drawn through thick cloth, that mark. The girl at the Boone place, trail horse shoe worn to one side. No sentence long enough to indict, yet together they stood like a new fence in the middle of town, straight and silent as a post. Ralph stayed a moment longer before turning away, his boot sole pressing into the flour dust, leaving a dark scuff. The wind erased it quickly, but what had been seen could not be unseen. By evening, the story of the loaf on
They would surf gravitational waves between stars, build highways through hyperspace, and perhaps even learn to kindle new stars when old ones died.
Cottonwood, the story split down many streets. At the saloon, the loaf on the boards gained a few details courtesy of memory or imagination. At the smithy, it was trimmed to Boone stood in the square, talking about a hoof print. At the church, a widow whispered to her pewmate that Elias had done what no one else dared. Clara went home early. On the walk, she didn't meet Elias, but the morning still stayed with her, a feeling she couldn't name. It had been a long time since anyone had stood openly on her side without asking for something in return. That didn't erase fear, but it left a hairline crack in the wall she kept around herself. By evening, autumn wind was curling through Cottonwood's narrow alleys. The loaf was surely gone, but the hoofprint in its flour was set now in the minds of many. No declarations, no public talk, yet from that day forward, the glances people traded carried a new layer of understanding. And Clara, in her small room, knew that, though she wasn't ready to trust fully, she had gained an ally. Not all allies have to step inside your door to count as one. Sometimes one act in the middle of a public square is enough to let you know you're not entirely alone. Part 12. The story no one speaks. Afternoon in Cottonwood felt as though the whole town had exhaled at once. The sun was low, staining the street a tarnished gold, and the hammering from the distant smithy sounded as if it came from another day. Ralph Denton was nowhere to be seen. No one said he'd left town, and no one claimed he'd be back. But the gap he'd left in the square that morning was still there, like an empty chair at a table that everyone avoids mentioning. Elias Boone rode back to the ranch without taking the main road. He cut along a creekside trail where willow branches spilled shadows over muddy water. His eyes stayed forward. No one stopped him, no one called out. They seemed to understand, or chose to let him go unbothered. On the saddle behind him, the loaf he'd carried to town was gone. In Cottonwood, bread never stayed long, especially Boone's bread. But this time he didn't care who had eaten it. only that it had done what it needed to do. Clara Wynne remained in her small wooden cabin by the east fence. She had shut the window early, but the sunset still found its way through the curtain's gap, striping the floor in gold. On the table sat a sheet of paper folded in two. Beside the worn cloth bag she kept within reach, the paper wasn't hers. It had been written by another woman, hurried in a slanted hand. The letter was short, just a few lines of instruction, and a promise to meet again that had never been kept. Clara kept it as the last thing left from another life, before strange hoofprints appeared outside her door, before she learned to bow her head and avoid holding anyone's gaze too long. That evening, after returning from the market, Clara took out the letter. She read it again, not because she'd forgotten, but because she needed to hear the voice of the writer in her mind. Yet today the words seemed to sound different, like that voice had somehow known a day would come when someone, a man with no claim on her past, would stand in the square on her behalf. Outside, hoofbeats passed slowly, neither hurried nor threatening. Clara still listened, as habit, but this time her heartbeat didn't climb into her throat. The morning's image returned. Elias in the square, his hand placing the loaf. The quiet line about bread and hoof marks. No names, but everyone understood. The feeling was strange to her. She was used to everyone minding their own quiet, as she did. She had never thought anyone would step in, even with so small a gesture. Now that it had happened, she didn't know whether to trust it or keep her guard up. The stove had been cold since morning, but Clara didn't feel the chill. She slipped the letter back into her bag and sat down. The last of the lights slid off the table, giving way to the familiar dark. Only this darkness wasn't exactly the same as yesterday's. Somewhere deep inside, a narrow gap had opened, not wide enough to let the wind in, but enough to tell her the wall she'd built all these years could change shape. And sometimes the one to start that change wasn't the person she hoped for, or even one she was ready to trust, but the one who showed her she wasn't entirely alone. Part 13. Morning Tea. The next morning, Cottonwood woke more slowly than usual. The first light didn't cut through the night like a sharp blade. It crept in, slipping over a thin veil of mist that clung to rooftops and pasture. Even the roosters seemed to crow a beat late, as if the whole town needed an extra moment to grow used to this new quiet. Elias Boone had been up since the sky was still a pale blue-green. He was accustomed to reaching the stables before sunrise, but today he lingered longer on the porch. The early air was so pure his breath looked like smoke. The wind carried the scent of wet grass, of pine wood still warm from yesterday's fire. In his hand, the bread knife still bore a few dry crumbs, the last trace of the loaf he had taken to the square. When he stepped inside, the table wasn't as he'd left it. The chair across from his was no longer empty. Beside the steaming kettle was a teacup already poured, fragrant steam curling upward, and next to it a small plate holding a few fresh slices of bread. Clara Wynne stood at the stove, ladle in hand over a pot of porridge. She wore a faded, earth-colored dress, clean and neatly pressed, her hair tied back without a single loose strand. Elias paused. He never expected anyone to prepare something for him, least of all this morning. Clara heard his steps, but didn't turn straight away. She spoke softly, her voice as even as if she were noting the weather. The tea's ready. There was a time when Elias would have distrusted any kindness. He knew too well how such gestures could be hooks sunk into trust, only to be withdrawn later, leaving a hollow deeper than before. But this morning, looking at the teacup steaming in the pale light, he saw no hook, only a calm warmth, like a thin blanket on a cold dawn. He sat down, his hand resting at the cup's handle. The tea was hot enough to sting his fingertips, pulling him fully into the moment. Clara poured the porridge into a bowl, set it before him, and then took the seat opposite. She didn't rush to eat, nor did she drop her gaze as she usually did. They ate in silence. The faint clink of spoon against bowl was the only sound, but it wasn't the heavy, airless silence of before. It was a space just wide enough for both to breathe, without fear of losing their place. Elias thought back to the morning in the square, when he'd placed the loaf down and let his words fall into the crowd. He hadn't waited for a result, nor expected anyone to answer in any tangible way. Yet here it was, this cup of tea, this bowl of porridge. An answer that was neither loud nor indebted, but enough to tell him that suspicion had stepped back a pace. Outside, the sun was climbing. Light poured across the table, catching the tea, so that its steam seemed to dissolve into the air. Elias took a sip, warmth spreading through him, carrying with it a feeling he'd nearly forgotten, the sense that someone, even in the smallest way, had chosen to share the morning with him. Part 14. A Roof Made of Silence. That morning, the eastern pasture lit up like a gold blanket being pulled back to show the soft veins of the wind. The sun was still low, its sideways light catching on every dry blade and fence rail, making the valley seem to breathe more evenly. On the wooden porch, Elias Boone sat sharpening a knife on an old stone, each draw sounding short and dry, before fading into the cool air. From the kitchen door came the slow spill of fresh-baked bread's scent. Clara Wynne stepped out, a dish towel draped over her arm, and stood a moment for her eyes to adjust. She looked out across the gold field where the cattle bunched into dark islands. Today, her step was steady, neither hurried nor leaning, and for a brief second, her shoulders lowered, as if she'd remembered how to stand fully in the wind. Elias paused, tilting the blade to catch a hairline glint along its edge, then slid it into its sheath. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Clara didn't either. They shared the same porch, the same sky, and their silence no longer felt like a wall built to keep things out. It felt like a roof broad enough for them both to shelter under. From the town's direction, the church bell rang a short peal, broken by the wind before it could carry far. Cottonwood had been quieter lately. Stories still passed through saloon and storefront, but the sly laugh that used to creep in had been missing. Folks spoke of the loaf on the boards, of a white dusted hoofprint, of how that morning in the square there'd been no shouting, only the long, steady exchange of glances that shifted a man's place in town. No one called it punishment. They called it seeing clear. And here, seeing clear was change enough. One afternoon, Elias went down to buy salt. The innkeeper, who'd never missed a chance to pry, didn't smirk as before. She only nodded so slightly the wind might have stolen it. At the forge, the hammer slowed a beat when he passed. No one stepped forward to speak. They let him go by, as always, but without the hard chill in their eyes. The town had learned a different kind of quiet. Clara still rarely went to market. When she did, she picked the off hours, buying flour, salt, and tea from the scatterbrained old shopkeeper. Passing the saloon porch, she kept her gaze ahead, and nothing happened. Not because someone was standing guard, but because many ordinary eyes were watching in an unremarkable way. And for someone used to walking in fear, that ordinary was a gift. In the evenings they sat at the old wooden table, still beans, bread, and pickled greens. But the chair opposite was no longer an absence. It was filled. Sometimes, when pouring tea, Clara would push the pot toward Elias before serving herself. That small act repeated often enough to become habit, and Elias, cutting bread, would sometimes set aside a thicker slice for her, the way a man saves the crisp crust for someone else. No words of thanks passed between them. They didn't need to. Gratitude lived in the way Clara opened the door earlier to let in the kitchen breeze, in how she folded the tablecloth neatly before dousing the lamp. It was in Elias checking the east fence twice a week, sometimes sinking a new post where the ground was soft. Small acts, separate, but together they formed a house. One afternoon, the sky threatened rain. Clouds hung low enough to touch. Clara was gathering laundry when she froze, facing the trail. Across the darkened grass lay fresh hoofprints, not stopping, just passing through, heading north. She looked longer than needed, then carried on with her work, calm as someone who knows the storm will break elsewhere. That night, when clearing the table, she set a thicker slice of bread on Elias's plate. He picked up his knife to trim it, then didn't. It had been a long time since he'd let himself take something whole. Weeks passed. Cottonwood remained itself, the wind carving the ground, dust settling on windowsills. But some things had shifted in ways too small to name. When a young woman walked by, people didn't turn away. When a silent man stepped into market, the space that opened around him felt less cold. Folks said it was just a loaf of bread that did it. It was simpler to say it that way. The truth was likely that everyone wanted their town to breathe a little easier, and the loaf was only the reminder at hand. On a night with the first edge of winter, the stove glowed red. The wind slipped through the boards and stopped at the blanket hung behind the door. Elias fed in another stick, waited for the fire to catch, then sat. Clara poured tea. When she set the cup before him, her hand didn't pull back right away. It paused, just a fraction. He looked up. Eye met eye. Nothing needed to be said. The moment closed as lightly as a coal settling. Outside, the pasture lay still under a sky full of stars. Inside, the silence became its own light, not blinding, but enough to see by. In a place where people believed power belonged to the loudest voice, sometimes the change came from its opposite, a man setting a loaf down in right place at the right time, and a woman, after many days spent in the shadows, choosing to sit across from him without needing to be asked. Tomorrow they would rise early again, splitting the same old work. Maybe Ralph Denton would leave Cottonwood for good. Maybe he'd linger in the horse lots to the north. That mattered less than the fact the town now looked at itself differently, and this house held one more shared breath. If asked why, folks would talk about the loaf in the square. Elias and Clara, if pressed, might only nod and smile faintly, because in the end, some roofs need no shingles to be called a roof. They're built from small acts done in the right place, and some people, without promising or declaring a thing, still remain under a roof made of silence. The evening wind in Cottonwood still carried the scent of dry grass and wood smoke. On the old wooden table, the freshly cut loaf gave off gentle steam, and the seat, once left empty, was now filled by someone quietly pouring tea. Nothing more needed to be said. Sometimes presence alone is the most complete answer. If this story has touched you at any moment, leave a few words in the comments below. They don't have to be long, only sincere, because sometimes a single word spoken is enough to let someone know they are no longer alone.